My name is Noelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director of Communications for the Hudson River Presbytery. Here's a recent example of how the Hudson River Presbytery has advocated for justice in our community. In March, workers at Mrs. Green's supermarket, who had been illegally fired by the company for trying to form a union, reached out to the Hudson River Presbytery through our longtime partner, Rural and Migrant Ministry. The fired workers had been without income and on a picket line for 3 months, and they were seeking allies from the religious community to stand with them and to call on Mrs. Green's supermarket to rehire the workers, to pay them back wages, and to cease their campaign of intimidation. The Presbytery team, now known as Advocacy, Education, and Networks, invited several of the fired workers to come to the March Presbytery meeting to share their stories and answer questions as a part of our regular Presbytery community conversations. That team also prepared a resolution calling upon Mrs. Green's to rehire the 9 fired workers and undertake fair labor practices. In addition, the resolution instructed Hudson River Presbytery's stated clerk to convey to the Toronto Conference of the United Church of Canada our concerns about the practices of the owners of Mrs. Green's, which is a subsidiary of the Toronto-based Catalyst Capital Group, as well as our hopes that they would rehire the workers and engage in fair labor practices. This resolution had a first reading at the Presbytery's March meeting, where members of the Presbytery had an opportunity to also meet with the fired workers. In April, the workers invited members of the Hudson River Presbytery to join them for a prayer vigil outside of the Mrs. Green's store in Mount Kisco, New York. Teaching elders from nearby congregations gathered with workers outside the store, marching the picket line, listening to and sharing stories, and praying together. Then several workers and clergy went inside Mrs. Green's store to pray in various locations in order to draw attention to the workers' unlawful firing and make consumers more aware. At the Presbytery's stated May meeting, the team, now known as Advocacy, Education, and Networks, reported back on the vigil, noting that the workers had now been without pay and on the picket line for 5 months. Following a second reading of the resolution concerning Mrs. Green's, the Presbytery passed the resolution unanimously. The stated clerk of the Presbytery immediately sent a letter and the resolution to the CEO of Mrs. Green's and to the Toronto Conference of the United Church of Canada. 2 days later, the CEO of Mrs. Green's resigned. A month later, the National Labor Relations Board ordered Mrs. Green's to rehire the workers with back pay and to cease their intimidation of the workers. In July, the fired workers returned to work with back pay. The workers sent a thank you message to the Presbytery saying, "None of this would have happened if it wasn't for your support. We couldn't have gotten to the position we are now at without it. We still have work to do and still need your support." The Presbytery continues to monitor the situation and is ready to respond should the workers again face intimidation at Mrs. Green's. The Presbytery advocated with the fired workers, not for them. We were not a voice for the voiceless. Rather, we amplified the workers' voices by adding our own. The Presbytery ensured Presbytery members the opportunity to learn and ask questions about the proposed action and to think about our role as consumers. The Presbytery provided opportunities for individual members to participate in actions such as the vigil and pickets according to their own conscience, even while the resolution was still moving forward at the Presbytery setting. The Presbytery communicated clearly and quickly about the Presbytery's support for the unlawfully fired workers with Mrs. Green's once the resolution was passed. And finally, the Presbytery reaffirmed our connection to our sisters and brothers working at Mrs. Green's as they returned to a workplace where they had faced intimidation and been fired, knowing that they might again need the support of the broader community. We hope that this brief summary of our collective action with the Mrs. Green's workers will prove helpful in thinking about how the church can help advance justice in our world. Thanks.